There are no solutions, only trade offs. And now, that was said by the American economist Thomas Sowell, who was talking about the American society and the economic problems that they were facing. But I reckon it applies to leadership just as much. One of the true arts of leadership is the art and ability to navigate trade offs. Are we going to sacrifice today in order to achieve tomorrow? Are we going to fully resource one team but leave another short? Do we fire someone for poor performance today only to double the workload of one of our other good employees tomorrow when they leave? The reality is that it's rare for there to be any one right answer to these particular scenarios or trade offs that we have to make. We always have to consider the context, and they are context dependent. There is nuance that's there, and what may be effective today may turn out not to be effective tomorrow if we were to face the same decision. Many of the choices that we as leaders make can be viewed through the lens of trade-offs. And some of the more common ones that I face or experience and encounter when leaders are working through or with me and getting me to help work through these things with them is the trade-off between being complacent yet comfortable versus having the difficult conversation. It's around short-term profitability at the expense of long-term organizational health. Do we drive for max performance now rather than having a sustainably increasing performance over time over the next 5 years? Can you relate to any of these kind of trade-offs that you feel like you have to make? I think when we talk about trade-off choices, there's some common faults that we should be aware of as leaders. And here are 3 mistakes that I reckon I encounter a lot of leaders making in this particular space. You need to be aware of the default trade-off. So too many leaders, they have this bias one way or the other towards particular trade-offs. Now, I know I have a personal bias in favor of the long-term outcome rather than the short-term gain. Too often, bias like this can actually stop leaders thinking. They rely on their bias too heavily. Therefore, they make default choices, default trade-offs, rather than intentional ones. So you've got to be aware of that. You also need to be aware of the context, right? As I mentioned before, every trade-off should be made in consideration of the specific circumstances and the context. There is always context dependency. There is always nuance here that needs to be considered. There is no point trying to make a trade-off that favors long-term outcome if the very survivability of the business is in jeopardy in the short term, right? You've got to favor the short-term one in order to exist, in order to start making some long-term trade-offs there. And then beware the big picture. And really, rather than beware, what I'm talking about is be aware of the big picture. Every trade-off that you make should be moving you and the business forward towards your goal. You need to make it in context of the strategy of the business. Now, that's not to say that every every trade-off is going to take you forward in a direct line towards those big picture outcomes and towards the strategy objectives. It may be backwards or to the side, but you should be able to articulate, communicate, and know how that trade-off that you're making in the short term is going to contribute to moving you and the business forward in the longer term. All right. You need to make the trade-off in the context and in awareness of the bigger picture strategy space. Now, this is concept that I sometimes talk about around trade-off inconsistency. As I said, my personal bias is towards the long-term outcome. And what I've come to learn is that always chasing the long-term outcome means that I may never experience a win today, a short-term experience, win. And so the result is that the satisfaction and the motivation of my teams and myself often suffers because we just never seem to be achieving something. We're always chasing something in the future. And I've learned that sometimes choosing comfort today enables me to endure tomorrow. Sometimes taking the short-term win gives us the energy and the motivation and the enthusiasm to chase the longer-term, goal in the future. The reality is that trade-off inconsistency sometimes is the best way to keep long-term directional consistency. I'll say that again. Trade-off inconsistency can and is sometimes the best way to keep directional consistency. And this is not to be confused with, inconsistency of intent or inconsistency of commitment. We should always be able to articulate how the trade-off today will help us achieve tomorrow. Intent and alignment must always remain consistent, but at the same time, we need to not be so rigid that we're not afraid or that we are afraid to take one step back or to the side in order to take 3 steps forward. This is one of those paradoxes of leadership. It's less about solving a problem, all right, and it's more about managing attention. I think of the words of Andy Stanley, who said, whenever you try and solve a tension, you end up creating a problem. And so the key here, when we start talking about trade-offs, they're everywhere in leadership, but the key is to make every single trade-off on its merits. Always be intentional about the decisions that you are making. So my question to you is, what are the trade-offs that you are facing right now? I encourage you to take time to consider what's your bias in this space, what's the context of the situation, and what's the bigger picture for your business. Then make your choice, make your trade-off, do it intentionally. Until next time, lead well.